Good morning and welcome to ILSO Advisor webinar, Fungicide Applications to Mitigate Soybean Stresses, brought to you by the Illinois Soybean Checkoff. I'm Todd Steinacher, Agronomic Content Coordinator for ILSO Advisor, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning, and I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to address. If you included your CCA number when you registered for this webinar and you stay for the entire presentation, your number will automatically be submitted for one CEU in crop management at the conclusion of this webinar. If you are listening to this recording of this webinar, you will need to go to Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and self-report for credits. You can ask questions during the webinar by using the tool panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will have time for Q&As at the end of the presentation. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Jason Carr. Jason holds his bachelor's degree in natural resources and environmental sciences and a master's degree in molecular genetics from the University of Illinois. He is currently a technology development representative with Bayer Crop Sciences, where he leads agronomic research projects with corn and soybeans, focusing on creating tailored solutions for growers. Prior to his current role, Jason spent a decade in soybean breeding with Monsanto as part of a team developing numerous commercially successful varieties in relative maturities groups 2 and 3. Jason is also a 2021 CCA Soy Envoy, a position he previously held in 2019 and 2020. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Todd. So today I'd like to talk about fungicide applications and how fungicide applications can help mitigate stress in soybeans. Obviously, when we talk about stress, we're talking about a lot of different things. So generally we talk about abiotic and biotic stresses. So abiotic stresses would be things like the temperature, the amount of moisture, too much moisture, too little moisture, too hot, too cold, things that affect the plants. And then we have biotic stresses, which, generally we're talking about diseases and insect pressure. Another example of biotic stress is stress from weed competition, which can lead to some abiotic stresses also. And so when we think about weed competition, that's probably the only kind of stress that fungicides can't really help with. So, all those other stresses, we're going to talk about how fungicides can help relieve those and maintain the yield potential of the field. I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer before I start here today. So a lot of the information I'm going to show, the examples I'm going to show, the data I'm going to show is for Bayer products. Being a Bayer employee, that's what most of our research is focused on, obviously. And so, I want to point out that other manufacturers, other companies also have quality products. In a lot of cases, would have similar responses in some ways, and maybe one product performs better than another in other cases. But do your research. The concepts that I'm going to talk about would apply to multiple products. So do your research when choosing products. So today, I'm going to start off talking about, when we talk about fungicide, obviously that starts really early in the season. So we talk about seed treatments. Then getting into, a lot of times when we think about fungicide, we think about foliar application. So, most people have adopted fungicidal seed treatments. However, we don't have exact numbers, but there's probably about 3/4 of the soybean acres in the state of Illinois do not receive a fungicide application, which, as we're going to talk about today, that's really a missed opportunity, especially in today's high commodity price environment. Then we'll talk about making sure you have the right product to do what you want to do, and what application methods to use, and how to think about timing. And then I'll spend a little bit of time just showing some data from our research here in central and northern Illinois. So I'm going to start off talking about what is a fungus and what are fungicides. So this, I kind of titled this Plant Pathology 101. Probably information that most of you are familiar with, but I thought it would be good to kind of set a baseline of what we're talking about. So very basically, what is a fungus? So you can read the definition there. It's a group of unicellular, multicellular, or syncytial spore-producing organisms feeding on organic matter due to a lack of chlorophyll. So when we talk about fungi, we're talking about organisms that cannot produce their own food. We know that plants can produce their own food uh, by harvesting the sunlight and using nutrients. They can create chlorophyll and feed themselves, but fungi do not have this. And so they need to feed on other organisms. So we have two types of fungi. We have saprophytic fungi, which feed on dead plant material, which obviously they perform a lot of benefits in breaking things down, returning the nutrients back into the soil. But we also have parasitic fungi, which feed on living plant material. And those are what we're really most concerned about when we're talking about controlling things with a fungicide. So obviously fungi can be below or above the soil surface. They can attack all parts of the plant, the roots, the seeds, the leaves, the stems. They really can attack the plant in many different ways, and they can be commonly spread by a number of factors. So rain is a common way. Some of the spores will spread on the wind. Animals can do it, machinery can do it. We can infect a field with contaminated seed. There's a lot of ways that fungus can get into a crop. So if we remember back to our really basic plant pathology, as I mentioned before, we're going to keep this at a pretty high level. But basically, we need, traditionally we've thought about a disease triangle, and we've thought about the three things that we need in order to have a disease infection. And so obviously you have to have the pathogen. You have to have the disease present. If you don't have the disease present, it kind of goes without saying that you can't have the disease develop in the crop. You have to have a susceptible host. So, if we're talking about SDS, for example, when we have the pathogen present, obviously if we have corn in that field, it's not going to be a problem because it's not going to infect that host. And then we have to have an environment conducive to the disease development. So, talking about SDS as an example, early planting, compacted soils, moisture early in the season are the types of things that will cause that disease to show up as a problem later in the season. So if we take one part of that, I mentioned corn not being a host, but if we take one part of that triangle, one side of that triangle away, we don't get an infection. And if we take part of that triangle and we reduce it, so if we have less pathogen, you can see in the second example there, we have the host, we have a good environment for the disease to develop in, but we have less inoculum, we're going to get less development. And if we have plenty of pathogen, plenty of host, but the environment is not ideal, but maybe it's kind of borderline for that disease development, it's not going to develop to the same extent. And as I sort of mentioned, the disease triangle is a little bit of an outdated concept. We all learned that probably, but now we think of it more as a fourth dimension coming into that, more as a square. And we also factor in time. So you can have the pathogen present in sufficient quantities, you can have the host there, and you can have a perfect environment for it to develop. But if we don't have enough time, if one of those only lasts for a shorter amount of time, we're also going to have less development of the disease and less severity. So now one of the tools in our arsenal to combat fungi is genetic resistance. And so obviously we think of, we look at our soybean varieties and we look at what the Phytophthora resistance is, for instance. And so that's a way that we can also help manage the disease, and usually works best in combination with a good fungicide, because generally really high levels of pathogen, really good environment for it to develop in a lot of cases are going to overcome that resistance. And so you're still going to get development of the disease. So really, when we talk about resistance, we're talking about preventing or slowing down the successful infection by the pathogen. This is, obviously, if we don't have to use a chemical to control a problem, we're going to be more environmentally friendly. And generally, it's going to be economically better also. However, as I mentioned, it's not a perfect system. There's a lot of things that factor into whether we'll have really good resistance, uh, and sometimes it's difficult. And also, resistance in the genetics of the plant normally come at a cost. If we think about it, the plant has a certain amount of resources. It's going to put them into producing seed, which is the point of the plant. But if we're gonna produce, say, some kind of protein in the plant that's going to not allow a disease to infect, that's going to come at a cost. So generally, not 100% of the time, but as a general rule, if we have a disease resistance in a plant, it's going to help us because in most cases, we're going to have, we talk about something like Phytophthora, we're going to have that present in the field and we're going to need that resistance. But if we were in an environment where there was not the presence of that disease, we're probably going to see a little bit of reduced yield because the plant is doing something to overcome that disease. So what we're going to spend the most time talking about here today is chemical protection. So we're going to talk about preventing infection and preventing that pathogen from getting established in the susceptible host. So as long as the pathogen is in the area with the host, the contact is going to be made, and we're going to try to stop that in some way from either the spores from germinating or the disease from developing further, or somehow we're going to stop that from becoming as big of a problem as it would be without protection. And so we really want to also make sure that the protection, when we talk about protection, we want to do that before the plant actually becomes infected. So a fungicide, just at the most basic definition, is an agent that destroys fungi or inhibits their growth. So they're used for a couple of reasons: to control disease, to stop the disease from developing further. They're going to, in most cases, increase the productivity of a crop, and oftentimes they're used to improve the storage life and quality of the harvested material. So as an example, we'll probably talk a little bit later about seed-borne diseases such as phomopsis. So if you have a seed production field, you're going to want to really consider spraying a fungicide on that field, and probably do in most cases, to protect the quality of that seed, because obviously the quality of the seed is really important when it's going to seed. I spent 10 years in soybean breeding, and we harvested a lot of the seed for the next generation when we were developing varieties. And we sprayed every field if we were going to harvest seed off of it, just to protect the quality of that seed. So fungicide is a really important tool in instances when seed quality is extra important. So, obviously a big part of efficiently using fungicides throughout the year starts off with the seed. And so I want to talk a little bit about fungicidal seed treatments. And a point I really like to make, I'm a big proponent of early planting of soybeans. And, sometimes that idea is a little foreign, or, it's obviously more accepted at this point, but a couple years ago, some growers that had been around a long time, had a lot of experience, thought, we don't necessarily want to plant soybeans in early April. Why would we plant soybeans before corn? A lot of those kind of questions. And really the only reason we have that conversation is because of the widespread adoption of quality seed treatments over the last decade. So when we started using quality seed treatments, we really started to see the value of planting soybeans early, but they have to be protected against those diseases and the insects that are going to attack them early in the year before they germinate. In a lot of cases, and we've planted soybeans as early as the beginning of March, early in April. In some cases, they sit in the ground for a month and a half before they emerge. And it's really critical that we protect them from all those pathogens that are down there in the soil at that time. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the different diseases that we see, but the main point I want to take away from this slide is to illustrate that if you look at the conditions that favor development of these diseases, they're not all the same. So in a cool wet year, we're going to see Pythium, Phytophthora, and Fusarium being more of a problem. In a warm year, we might see Rhizoctonia. If it's dry, we might see more Phomopsis if it's wet. So it really depends on the conditions, and we need to choose a fungicidal seed treatment that has a combination of active ingredients that will protect us against multiple diseases. And when we talk about damping off, you can see that picture on the left there. We're talking about those seedlings just kind of curling and dying really early in the season. And that's a very common uh, symptom of these early season seedling diseases. And I don't have SDS on this list. But SDS we don't often think of as a seedling disease, but that's something that affects really early in the season. And there are a couple of quality treatments that are available to help control that disease also. So there are all kinds of active ingredients that are put into fungicidal seed treatments. And this is a table from the University of Illinois. This is from a couple years ago, just showing the various chemicals and the effectiveness of their control of certain diseases. And so you can see they don't all have the same control of all the diseases. Obviously, there's a handful that work well on Pythium. There's a handful that work well on Phytophthora. Most of them work pretty well on Rhizoctonia. SDS, we just have a couple of active ingredients that really work for that. And so you really, in order to control and have a well-balanced control of all the diseases, we need to have multiple active ingredients in the seed treatment. So I'm just going to use an example here of Acceleron seed treatment. This is something we look at quite a bit. And we have three different active ingredients in that seed treatment. And you can see if you look at the highlighted ones there, they provide protection against the different diseases. And so by mixing the active ingredients, we have protection against basically all the major diseases. And other companies also have their own proprietary seed treatments, and you're going to see a similar concept where they're going to mix active ingredients to try to control multiple diseases. So when we talk about fungicide seed treatment, I just think it's always important to talk about it, how critical it is, as I mentioned earlier, when talking about early season planting. So if we're talking about planting in early April, in the first half, even really any time in April, it's absolutely critical that we have a seed treatment. And we still see a benefit from a yield benefit often in later plantings, and that insurance is fairly cheap. And I think there's really no situation when I really recommend planting untreated seed, but we really see the biggest benefit in protecting the yield potential early in the season. So now I want to talk about foliar fungicides and how they're used, and give some recommendations on how to apply them, when to apply them. So really, as I mentioned earlier, although we really have seen proven value on the effectiveness of fungicides, we have a long ways to go in adopting them as a tool in soybeans in the state of Illinois and across the country. So, as I mentioned earlier, estimate about 3/4 of the soybean fields do not receive a fungicide application at this point. So there's a lot of potential there. And, we see an interesting concept that when we have some of the most popular varieties that have the most yield potential, some of these are also the ones that respond most favorably to a fungicide application. And that really plays into when we talk about how fungicides reduce stress. And we're going to talk about that as we go on. But by reducing stress, they allow those plants to maintain their yield potential. I think the record soybean yield is around 190 bushels. And most of our fields, we're not getting anywhere close to that. And so there's a lot of yield potential out there that we're leaving on the table. I always kind of use the example, if anybody remembers 2009, that year, how wet it was. That was also happened to be the year that Roundup Ready to Yield was launched. And we saw a lot of white mold that year in the central and northern part of the state. And we saw white mold really bad in the Roundup Ready to Yield varieties. And a big reason for that was that they were really healthy, robust plants. They had a lot of yield potential. They had a lot of leaves. They had bushy leaves. There wasn't much airflow down in the canopy. And we saw excessive white mold development. So white mold is really a high yield disease, and it's something that we don't have any level of quality genetic resistance for, other than the kind of the uh, double-edged sword benefit of, if you have a plant that's less robust, you're probably going to get slightly less white mold development. And so, something that's kind of spindly is not going to favor the conditions that favor white mold development. And so we really want to manage this disease with fungicides. And I'm going to talk a little bit as we go on. I'm going to show some results about how, the best way to do that. When we reduce tillage, we're going to also have more potential for disease development. And so as we move to minimum and no-till systems more and more, we're going to leave more crop residue there, and we're going to leave more inoculum for disease to develop. So again, we're pointing towards using fungicides as tools to kind of help manage those problems. And as seed becomes more expensive, as the other inputs become more expensive, and as the commodity prices go up, I think fungicide application becomes even more valuable. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but basically there's a couple different kinds of fungicides. We have contact fungicides or systemic fungicides. Most of the fungicides that we use today are systemic. Some of the older ones really kind of made a shield on the leaf that prevented the fungus from infecting the plant. And so, the problem with those was kind of like when you put on sunscreen and you go out on the beach, it protects you, but you get in the water, eventually it washes off. Same thing with these contact fungicides. The more rain we had, the more likely they'd be to wash off, and the less protection we got from them. Now, when we have something systemic, it's absorbed into the plant, and it protects from the inside out. And one difference that you see there at the bottom of that list is with systemic, we have a little bit more likelihood of developing resistant fungi. And so with our modern fungicides, it's even more important, just like when we think about weed control using multiple modes of action, we need to do the same thing with fungicides. I'm going to talk about those modes of action here. There's obviously 3 different modes of action that are commonly used for foliar fungicides for field crops. That is the strobilurins, the triazoles, the DMIs, or of which triazoles are one, and the SDHIs. I'm going to talk about each one of these groups at a fairly high level here. So when we talk about the QOLs, which the most commonly used, what we use generally in soybeans is strobilurins. So these work best when we use them preventatively, and they have very good activity on stopping the spores of the fungus from developing. So you can see in this electron micrograph picture of Asian soybean rust on the right-hand side here, if we have an untreated, we look in and we see that fungus developing in the plant cells. Whereas if we stop it from developing, you can see we still have the spores when we apply the fungicide here in the second picture, but they do not develop, they do not germinate, so we don't get damage from that plant. So the strobilurins have broad spectrum fungal activity. As I mentioned, they inhibit spore germination, and these are basically preventative. So we don't have a lot of curative activity. Once that fungus is started to develop, we're not going to see much help from the strobilurins. So they do a couple of things inside the plant, and I'm not going to get into a lot of physiology here, but it's important to remember that the activity of fungicides is not only based on the control of fungus. They also provide physiological benefits to the plant. So one of the things that strobilurins do is they inhibit ethylene production in the plants. And so plants, when ethylene is lower, they don't respond to stress as quickly. And so a lot of times a short-lived stress, they can live through it without any deleterious effects. So when we think about ethylene, the best example to think about ethylene is it's given off by mature, diseased, different plant tissues that are not actively growing. So if you think about the old adage that one bad apple spoils the bunch, that's why a rotten apple, you want to get it out of that bin of apples because it gives off ethylene, and the ethylene causes, the ethylene is created, produced in the plant when the diseased tissue or the mature tissue starts to give it off, and then ethylene causes rapid maturation of the plant tissue, and so it's kind of it feeds on itself, and things break down quicker. So if we can stop ethylene from being produced, or slow or limit ethylene production, we're going to see that plant stay healthier longer. It also, fungicides have been proven to promote lignification of the cell walls. And basically, when you see the stem stay greener a little bit longer in a really healthy plant, that's an example of that. So we'll see the plants stay healthier longer due to the cell walls being stronger and not losing their structure, and just the plant staying healthier longer and being able to produce for longer. And so all that is important to remember, because these products can promote yield increase even in the absence of disease development. And that's something we see consistently in our research. We'll go out, we'll take disease notes, we'll spray with a fungicide. And even in those cases where there's not necessarily disease even noticeable, we'll still see a benefit, in some cases a very big benefit, from fungicide application. This is just an example here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this is a greenhouse example, a growth chamber example of 3 plants, one being well watered, and then 2 of them having restricted water supply, so exposed to 4 days of severe moisture stress, where plant number 3 received application of Stratego yield. And you can see the plant number 2 is showing the effects of that water stress, and plant number 3 looks very similar to the plant that is getting plenty of water. You can see in the thermal image there that the plant number 2, which does not have the fungicide application and is under water stress, is hotter, it's droopier, it's just not as healthy. And so you're going to see, if you're at reproductive time of that plant, you're going to see more pod abortion, you're going to see more problems, you're going to see less yield out of that plant. Another thing that I'd like to point out here is, if you notice, since these are systemic, they enter the leaves, and if the leaf is not present at the time of the application, it's not going to necessarily have the fungicide in it. And you can see there on plant number 3 how that trifoliate that is recently opened does not look as healthy as the rest of the plant, and that's because it's not getting the effect of the fungicide in that plant. The third group is DMIs, which includes the triazoles, and these, I'm sorry, this is the second group. These really are kind of do it all. So they can prevent infection, they can cure infection, and they can protect the plant. Now, when we talk about curative, what we're talking about is, once that fungus has started to develop, it can stop that infection and it can stop it from going any further. We don't want to make the mistake of thinking that it can heal a lesion on a plant that has already developed. So if we have a lesion on a plant that's from the fungus developing, that's not going to go away. That damage is done, but we can stop it from spreading further and creating more lesions. So triazoles have broad spectrum fungal activity, whereas the strobilurins are a little bit more specific. They really interfere with membrane production in the plants. And so you can see in those electron photos there on the right-hand side, we have a healthy fungal structure, and then we have one where the outer membranes of that structure have been disrupted. The tissue kind of leaks out, and it causes the fungus to stop developing. So we do see from the triazoles also some physiological reactions like we talked about with the strobies, but a lot of that effect comes from the strobilurins. Most of the yield increases in triazoles come from actual disease control and not so much from those physiological reactions in the plant. We can see some resistance development to triazoles. One thing that's common with this kind of chemistry is we can apply a higher rate of the fungicide and we can overcome that resistance in a lot of cases. Another interesting thing is, due to the type of resistance that develops to this mode of action, if we were to discontinue the triazole use and not use it for a year or two or for a certain amount of time, the population again shifts back to normal in most cases. So we don't see long-lived resistance if we just switch away from this mode of action and then come back to it. The final group is SDHIs. One of the SDHIs that we're all familiar with is Fluopyram, which is Olivo, is the active ingredient in Olivo. And so one thing about these is they're pretty specific. So, if we think about Olivo, it really doesn't have effectiveness on too many things that we commonly see, other than it's very effective against SDS. And these work by stopping the fungus from respiring, basically, choke off its supply of air and cause it to die. So as I mentioned, these are very, very specific. So the example of Fluopyram is a good example because it's very specific to certain diseases. It's not a broad spectrum product. So it stops the fungus from producing energy. This is usually a preventative. It stops it from. It has to be applied before the infection has gone too far. It does have some curative activity in some cases, and with a product like this, due to the way it works, there's a high risk of resistance developing. So definitely is something that we want to use in conjunction with other active ingredients. So as I've mentioned a couple times, it's really important that we have multiple modes of action. And so, there's a couple reasons for that. There's several reasons for that. One is that we broaden the performance of the product by combining the strengths of the various products. I think a good example of that was the seed treatment table that I showed, where all the different active ingredients have a lot of different effectiveness against different diseases. And this also allows us to be more consistent across multiple weather conditions, because we don't know what kind of disease is going to be the most likely to show up in a certain year. We don't know what the weather is going to do. And so if we use multiple modes of action, we can protect against the likelihood of multiple diseases developing. So also another thing that happens with multiple modes of action is we can attack the disease in different ways. So, strobilurins and SDHIs, they both inhibit respiration. They both stop spores from germinating, while triazoles, as I mentioned, stop membrane production. And so sometimes we're attacking the same disease with multiple modes of action, and we're doing it in a different way. And so obviously, same thing with herbicides. When we come at something with different modes of action in different ways, we're going to delay resistance to that product, and we're going to have a better likelihood of killing the plant, or I'm sorry, in this case, killing the fungus much more quickly. So it's good, obviously we need preventative effects. Those preventative is great, but also in a lot of cases we need curative effects, because we need to stop the infection that has already started. So here's an example. Again, I'm using our product here, Delaro Complete, which is really a combination of 3 different fungicides, and they all have different diseases that they control. So The triazole component of Proline of Delaro Complete is also labeled as Proline. It's really effective against white mold, rust, brown spot, Cercospora, frog eye, different things. The strobilurin is effective against Cercospora, rust, and fusarium, while the SDHI component is effective against Cercospora, septoria, and white mold. And so we have different active ingredients, as I've been saying, that are effective against different diseases. So I just have an example here of how this all comes together to protect the yield potential of the crop. So we have, example here of some field view images of a field that had split application of fungicide. And, right away, we start looking at the field health maps. We can see a big difference. This is about a month after the application. We can see a big difference in the field health there, where we have, the part that had fungicide applied was much healthier, stayed greener. And in most cases, that's going to translate to yield. This is some plants pulled from that. And I think the really big takeaway of this is, we look at the treated, we look at the untreated, you can definitely see a visual difference in those plants. And the untreated, important point I want to make here is that untreated portion of the field had the exact same yield potential in those plants as the treated portion of the field. And we didn't gain pods from applying the fungicide. We protected the pods that plant was going to produce. And so we lost pods where we did not apply the fungicide. So we're really, especially in a high commodity price environment, we're really leaving money on the table. We're leaving yield on the table by, in many cases or most cases, by not applying a fungicide. And I just want to real quickly make the point that I'm not talking about insecticide here today, but in most cases, I think where a fungicide is applied to soybeans, I think insecticide is generally mixed in the tank with it. And that's obviously good practice because we're going across the field. The insecticide doesn't add a lot of cost. And we can really see, especially in this last year, and I'm going to show a little bit of data in a couple minutes here, but we really see, we saw a huge benefit from fungicide in a lot of places this year. But a part of that was the insecticide component, because if you remember, we had bean leaf beetles that were much more of a problem than they've really ever been in my memory. And you can see the difference between the health of the plants on the left that were not treated and the plants on the right. The ones on the left, not only do we see the plant health benefits where the plants on the right are greener, but we can also see the amount of insect feeding on those plants on the left. And so, it's always a good idea to throw insecticide in the tank when applying fungicide. And I think that's a practice that most people do. And we generally see a synergistic effect to those two products. So how do I know whether or not to spray? We kind of have a checklist here. The kind of things, the kind of conditions that are going to lead to disease development, that they're going to make a fungicide more effective or more important. You can get disease forecasts. I think the University of Illinois produces these disease forecasts. Bayer definitely produces forecasts to show the risk of a certain disease developing in a certain year. But these conditions on the left are the kind of conditions where we're going to see greater disease development. And so, obviously, a lot of the fungi that we see being a problem are favored by wet conditions. And so if we have frequent rainfall, high dew, high humidity, if we have free moisture on the leaf surface for 10 plus hours day after day, we're obviously in conditions where we're going to see more fungal development. And so that's the more of these we have as we go through this checklist, the more probability there is that we're going to see yield benefit from a fungicide application. If we have a continuous crop situation, so if we have soybean on soybean, we're obviously going to see a higher likelihood of disease development. Mentioned earlier, no-till or reduced tillage practices. Planting date can be a factor. We talk about this more in corn. It's probably less of a factor in soybeans to a certain extent, but planting date can play into whether or not we're going to see disease develop. Obviously the disease susceptibility, we talked about genetic resistance. So when we talk about the susceptibility of the variety, we're going to have certain ones that are more susceptible to disease, and those are going to benefit more, obviously, from a fungicide application. If the field is under stress, if we've received hail, that's going to provide a place for that fungus to infect. The plants are already stressed, and they're also going to have open wounds where that pathogen can get into the plant a lot easier. If we have, high moisture, we talked about, if we have very dry, some of the times those conditions favor fungal development, and also they stress the plants, and so they're going to put a stress on yield. If we start seeing disease in the field, obviously that would be a condition where we want to spray. But as I mentioned before, we don't always want to rely on seeing the disease, because a lot of times by the time the disease has started to develop to a point where we can visually see symptoms, it may be too late to get the maximum benefit out of the fungicide. If we have a history of the field having diseases, though, that's definitely a field we're going to want to take a little bit stronger look at. And as I mentioned before, any grain that's sold for seed or for some kind of premium market, a food grade type crop, we definitely, are going to want to strongly consider fungicide in those cases to protect the quality of that seed. So how about timing? We always basically talk about an R3 timing for soybeans. Really, the window is probably R2 to R4. The timing is not super critical. It's more important that we get it on in that general time frame than that we worry so much about the timing that we maybe hold off and maybe don't get something on because say we're at late R2 and we say we want to wait a week to apply or 3 days to apply, and then suddenly we get a weather event that keeps us out of the field for a while. We're gonna we want to get it on, and the exact timing is not so critical. We usually see a pretty wide window that we get a yield response from applying the fungicide. So there's an exception. There are probably multiple exceptions, but the biggest exception we think about, especially in central and northern part of the state, is white mold. And so for white mold application, white mold infects the plants through the flowers. And so we need to get a fungicide on when those soybeans start to flower. And so I'm going to show a little bit of data again here when I get to the data portion, but we really see the best control of white mold when we have an R1 and an R3 fungicide application. So we really get a big benefit from applying twice to control white mold. And there's other instances, white mold is one example, but there's probably other instances of diseases where the timing is maybe a little bit more critical. Now, does the time of the day matter? Sometimes people ask the question, is it better to spray in the morning? Is it better to spray in the afternoon? Is there a different timing? Sometimes, I guess a general rule of thumb is if the humidity is higher, we're going to have better efficacy of the fungicide. And the main reason for that is it's going to evaporate not quite as fast. More of that active ingredient is going to stay on the leaf. It's going to have more time to get translocated into the leaf. And, we just get more absorption of that chemical into the plant. If we spray in the middle of the day when, and especially on a dry day when it's not real humid, sometimes that can evaporate pretty fast and it's going to be less effective at getting into the plant. Now, we've done some research. I don't have a lot of specific results, but we really see pretty similar results with using a ground rig or using aerial application. So it's not really that critical, the method of application. It's more important that we get that fungicide on the crop if we want to see the benefits. So now I'm gonna show a few results here, just a few slides of results from some of our local trials here in the state of Illinois, what we've seen from fungicide and what we've seen over the last couple of years. And I'm going to start off with looking at a graph of in 2020. This data set here is 85 locations or variety by location comparisons. About 60 of those are in the state of Illinois. So this is about 3/4 Illinois data. So it's pretty local data. And we saw amazing win rates for the fungicide in the state this year. You know, a lot of growers saw probably as big a fungicide response as they've ever seen. 93% of the time in this data, we saw the fungicide causing a yield increase, and 82% of the time that was over 2 bushels, which, you know, if you think about the application cost and the cost of the chemical, probably 2 bushels is a good rule of thumb. You know, maybe a little bit less this year, depending on the prices, but 2 bushels to kind of get back your cost. So about 82% of the time, we probably saw an economic advantage to spraying fungicide. Now, you know, you can see on this graph, there's a handful that are over there on the left-hand side where we, you know, saw yield decrease. You know, a lot of times that is probably just error in the data set, and, you know, maybe some of the positive ones also. There's a lot of variables other than the fungicide application that we look at when we look at data, when we parse the data out. So if we think about it, you know, these things are a lot of times the field is half sprayed, half unsprayed, sprayed with a check strip. You know, there's a lot of different layouts that it can have. And, you know, if it's the field is sprayed and we leave a 60-foot check strip, you know, it could just happen that that check strip, you know, had some kind of conditions that really were beneficial to the crop development. Some other part of the field had something negative in it. And so, you know, that really illustrates why it's really important when we look at data to not look at a single location in a single year and draw too many conclusions on it. And that's kind of the danger. You know, there's benefits and dangers doing on-farm research. On-farm research is always great. It's always good to know how things perform in your own conditions on your own farm, but you always have to be careful not to take too much from that and assume that that's how it's going to respond every year, because there's multiple other factors that can come into play that can, you know, be unknown and cause you to draw an incorrect conclusion potentially. I talked about white mold. So in 2019, we had a lot of moisture. We had some white mold development. And we can see, as I mentioned, you know, spraying a fungicide on white mold, that's important. We saw a yield increase. By going from Delaro to Proline, we looked at an ingredient that is more effective on white mold, and we saw another yield increase. By going to Delaro Complete, which would be a combination of Delaro, it would be multiple modes of action and an additional mode of action, we saw better control. But where we really saw the best control is when we do a 2-pass system for white mold. So when we come in at R1, we come in at R3, we see much better control. So in specific circumstances, we have to be aware of what disease we're trying to combat, and we have to plan our fungicide regimen accordingly. We look at the last couple of years, we've done quite a bit of work looking at variable populations and how effective the fungicide is in variable populations. And so, you know, in my mind, I would think that when we have a higher population, we're going to get more disease development. That just makes sense. We're going to have an environment that is more conducive. If we think back to that disease triangle, we're going to increase the environment, the likelihood that the disease is going to develop. However, you know, over the last several years of doing this kind of research, we don't really see, which is a little bit surprising to me. I would have thought we would have seen a bigger increase in yield from the fungicide application in a higher population, but we really don't see that. We really see pretty consistent responses to fungicide in higher or lower populations. In fact, in some cases, we've seen a higher response to fungicide in lower populations, which I can't really explain other than reducing, you know, you can't explain it from a disease standpoint, but you can explain it from a plant stress standpoint, where we're protecting that plant, you know, each one of those plants, getting it to its full potential. Because in a lower, you know, in a lower population environment, we are seeing, or we're going to see less stress on those plants, and each one is going to contribute more, you know, as a percentage. We're going to see more pods on each individual plant. But typically what we've seen, and this is pretty consistent, but we see around 120,000 population with a fungicide being our most profitable configuration when we factor in the application cost of the fungicide and the value of the crop and the seed cost. So I broke this out into 2019 and 2020 just as an illustration because as I mentioned before, remember 2019 we planted very late because it was wet all year. There was a lot of prevent plant acres, and we really saw our best even in those late plantings we saw our best return on investment in that around 120,000 population with the fungicide. Even in those conditions where we had pretty low disease development. In fact, no noticeable disease development in these conditions in that year. Then we looked at 2020. As I mentioned before, we saw huge responses to fungicides in a lot of cases. A completely different year than 2019. Most were planted earlier. We again didn't necessarily see a lot of visible disease development, but we did see, as I mentioned, the bean leaf beetle feeding. I'm showing this data as a fungicide application, but we also had insecticide, and we saw additional benefit from the insecticide in this past year. One question that growers may have is, or one concern, they may say, well, I'd like to use a fungicide. I definitely see the benefits, but I don't want is that going to affect harvest? Is that going to make the crop go later? And definitely there would be a reason to believe that. The stems, as I mentioned earlier, are going to stay green a little bit later. And I think about that a lot of times. We have some soybean varieties that stay green really later into the season, and that can be a little bit of a problem for harvest, but it also turns out that most of those are some of our highest yielding varieties. And I really think, in corn it's pretty commonly accepted that good stay green in corn is a good thing where the plant stays healthy later in the season. But in soybeans, we haven't necessarily, that's not necessarily our mindset. We think of green stem as kind of being a problem, but I think in a lot of cases, we're overlooking the fact that that plant is staying healthy longer and giving us a little more yield potential. So in this past year, I wanted to look at really how much is that maturity effect. And so we had a couple locations where we flew them with a drone, and we applied an algorithm to identify at what day the plants matured. So we're probably, this is generated automatically. We're probably, within a day maybe. We can really identify when that plant is mature. And what we saw, which was interesting to me, is that we really didn't find a measurable difference in the maturity in the time in which those plants matured. And so at any population, I thought maybe there'd be a correlation between population and maturity and fungicide, and we really didn't see anything. Really, the population was irrelevant, as well as the fungicide application and what we saw. Now at harvest, I collected some data on the moisture with and without the fungicide application. And when we look at an early soybean, we didn't see much difference in the moisture. Obviously, that early soybean, by the time we got to it, had a little bit more time to dry down. Kind of a mid-range soybean, we saw a little bit of a difference, but not much. And when we looked at a later soybean, we actually saw a little bit of increase in moisture. That you can see in the picture on the left, that's a picture of the field where this data was collected. And you can see from the perspective of the picture, the bottom half of the picture was where the fungicide was not applied. And you can see the plants, just the difference in color where the fungicide was applied. It wasn't a harvestability issue, but we did see a little bit wetter seed in that crop, which actually, I would argue that's a benefit, because obviously you'd rather take 13% soybeans to the elevator than 10% soybeans. So that's just a little bit of data to look at. Hopefully I've laid out some of the benefits of fungicides. Hopefully I've helped explain what we see from that and why we see those benefits. And I think there's a few minutes here that I can take a few questions if somebody has some.
Thanks, Jason. As folks do submit the questions in, we do have some that's already been submitted into us, so we'll start with those. First off, could a seed treatment fungicide be considered overlapping the AI if we're using something similar in the seed treatment and from a post application?
Well, that's a good question. Not something I've really given a lot of thought. I would probably not necessarily consider that overlapping AIs. We're really targeting different diseases below ground and above ground. And so when we use those active ingredients underground, we're really, in most cases, not targeting the same pathogens. They're not there at the same time, at least not actively growing. So I would not consider that to be overlapping AIs. I'm afraid we may have lost Todd.
Nope, I'm back on. My
Okay.
internet just cut out on me, Jason. The next question would be as far as putting foliar nutrients in with.
We may have lost Todd there momentarily, but I think his question was about foliar nutrients in with the fungicide application. That's not something, honestly, that we've spent a lot of time looking at. The foliar nutrients, I think, is something that sometimes, it can be a little bit more variable in the response sometimes. And so, we have not looked at that and whether there would be, any kind of synergistic effect or anything like that. I can't honestly answer that question.
Okay, and then the last question we have, Jason, and I think you kind of touched on it, but as far as the timing of application throughout a given day or just throughout the season.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as I mentioned, we really want to target the R3 timeframe, but there's a pretty good window, R2 to R4, when we can get that on. The time of the day, we don't generally see a large response from. We actually have some trials set up this year because I think that's becoming more and more of a question. And so we really have some trials set up to actually look at that fairly closely, where we're going to go out and spray multiple times throughout the day on multiple varieties. We're looking at it in corn also. And so I think that's something that we don't see as critical. I mean, the best time to spray is, when it's in that relative time frame and when it works into your operation, because it's far more important to get the fungicide on than it is to really parse, specific timing of it. And so hopefully, next year I'll have some more information on if we do see a difference during the day, but there's some anecdotal stories that maybe we do, but I think any evidence that we really have at this point is pretty inconclusive. It doesn't seem to make a huge difference.
Okay, well, we just had another question pop in, Jason. Thoughts on early application of fungicides on soybeans around post herbicide trip?
So again, I know that's something that we've looked at in corn. We haven't really looked at it too much in soybeans. It's not something that we've considered a whole lot. It would be interesting to see some research around that. In a high commodity price environment, there's obviously a lot of things that make more sense than we would have thought in under other conditions. And so that's definitely something that should be evaluated, but I don't have any answer for that.
Okay, and I think that might have been our last question. I don't see any more coming in, Jason. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude our webinar on fungicide applications to mitigate soybean stress. If you could please take a few moments at the end of this webinar to answer the post-event survey. And again, this recording will be presented on the checkoff-funded website, illsoyadvisor.com. Thank you for all attending. Thank you, Jason.